So hello and welcome. My name is Michelle Cutler. I am the programs manager at the GVPTA. This is our day of taking care for the Making a Scene Gathering event 2024. I and the GVPTA live and operate on unceded territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh land. We have folks coming in from a lot of places in the world today, which is really exciting. So they'll talk about where they are when we get going. Just a few things about making a scene. This year we are focusing on care, restoration, and nourishment because that feels like what a lot of folks need right now. We had our first panel this morning, just a couple hours ago, which was focusing on joy, creating joy, which was a really lovely conversation. And that's going to be available online probably by the end of the week, as will this panel, and as will our final panel of the day, which is happening later, which is around dealing with challenging content and working with that on stage. Our in-person event is happening 1 week from today in Vancouver, and it's going to be a really, really lovely day around nourishment, restoration. We have a keynote speech from Tasha Faye Evans, and lots of food. A couple administrative and technical things. We have both captions and ASL interpretation available. You can just see the buttons at the bottom of your screen if you would like to utilize those. I will talk a little bit about our sponsors. Our funders are the BC Arts Council and the City of Vancouver. We have sponsorship from the Professional Association of Canadian Theatre, from CUPE, from CITT, from IATSE, Local 168, and from Opera Mariposa, who have sponsored masks and safety supplies for our in-person gathering. If you have any technical questions throughout our Zoom session today, you can put those in the chat and Kenji or I will respond. If you have questions for the panelists, you can put those in the Q&A window and Vicki will see those and they'll incorporate them as they chat. We can't see you in your windows, but we can see what you type. If you are interested in attending the in-person day and you have any financial constraints, we do have financial subsidies available. So please go ahead and fill that out if you have any concerns at all about funding, and we're happy to include you. And I think that's it in terms of the logistics. And so I'm going to just welcome our panelists. We are talking about care in the face of the climate crisis, which is definitely on all of our minds a lot of the time, especially as the summer begins. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have our facilitator here, Vicki Stroich, who is the Artistic and Environmental Programs Manager of Caravan Farm Theatre. We have David Geary, the playwright, screenwriter, fiction writer, director, and a LMDA dramaturg and educator. Pedro Chamale, director, playwright, performer, and the artistic director of Rice and Beans Theatre. And Jodi Lammiman, who is an eco-spiritual director, artist, and community facilitator, and the founder of Refugia Retreats. I'm going to pass this over to Vicki now, and thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And yes, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the panelists for being here. I'm just going to give a little bit of context and sort of what the flow of the conversation will be, and then just say a few words about each of the panelists and invite them to speak to their own land acknowledgement and acknowledging where they are. So my name is Vicki Stroich, and as Michelle said, I live and work. I work at Caravan Farm Theatre, but I also live at Caravan Farm Theatre, which is on the unceded traditional territories of the Secwepemc and the Syilx Okanagan people. And my particular interest in this discussion is, a few years ago, I after spending quite a few years working in the nonprofit theater world, I worked in an environmental organization for 4.5 years, and then came here to Caravan Farm Theatre to start this role that combines art and environment and discover what that meant. And so that convergence is something that has always been of interest to me, and my concern about the climate crisis and how art and theater and the things that I know and value can contribute to that. And particularly in the outdoor theater context that I work in now on an 80-acre piece of property in the Okanagan, climate change is very present in a great many ways. And indeed, that sort of gathering and convening of our neighbors, of our community around story and around seeing each other and working together and experiencing things together has been really potent, especially because there is a lot of trauma about wildfire in particular, and increasingly drought in this area. And so for me, there's some specific interest right now in the convening power that we have as theater artists. And so it's exciting to be here. We're going to talk, care and creation is in the title. So we're going to talk to our panelists a bit about concepts of care and concepts of creation with the climate crisis in mind. So I wanted to just sort of, for each panelist, say a few words about why in many ways I'm excited to speak with them today, but just some things, and then invite them to give a land acknowledgement, and then we'll start with some of the questions. So David Geary, who has a mind and imagination that has been exploring the climate crisis regularly in his work. And so I'm really excited to have David here. David, would you like to say a few words and let us know where you're calling from?
Sure, thank you. Kia ora. I'm actually in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'm getting ready for the day. But when I'm in Canada, I am on the traditional territories of the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh in what is colonially known as North Vancouver. But here I'm on the Rangatane Māori people's rohi, and if you look in my thing, I'm from the Taranaki iwi, which is what you would call a First Nation in where you're all from. And my pronouns are he, they, and ia. And ia is the sort of non-gendered pronoun in Māori. So that's where I'm calling from this morning, and great to see everyone. I'll just pass it on now back to you, Vicki.
Great, thanks, David. Next, we have Jodi Lammiman. Jodi, it's great to have you here. Jodi, when I first started at the environmental organization that I worked at, which is called Alberta Eco Trust in Calgary, or Mokinstas, one of the first things I got to do was go to a workshop that Jodi ran through refugee retreats at the Calgary Women's Center about climate grief, that was my first introduction to that term and to that and first recognition of that feeling. So I'm really happy to have Jodi here. So Jodi, would you like to speak?
For sure. Thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I'm calling in from Mokinstas, which is colonially known as Calgary, Alberta, and in Treaty 7 territory. So this region includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kanawa nations, as well as the Eyathka Stoney Nakoda Nation, which consists of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsutena Nation. And the city of Mokinstas is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Otipemisiwak Métis government, as well as Métis Nation Battle River Territory, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. And those just changed from 3 to 5 and 6, so I'm still getting used to that part of the land acknowledgement. But thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Jodi. And there's, Pedro, I saw you were speaking off. I was gonna kill some time, but hi, Pedro, Pedro Chamale. Pedro, of course, is a wonderful creator, and I've admired his work for a long time. And I had the opportunity to work or learn a bit about a recent piece that Pedro was working on called Peace Country when he was at the Playwrights Retreat here at Caravan last year, which is really about the relationship of rural communities and northern communities in particular, like the one that Pedro grew up in Chetwynd, to the climate crisis and the sense of the political and economic shifts that are happening around the climate crisis. And so that sense of that community and how that community responds. And I really admired the way that Pedro was exploring that. And so Pedro, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. Yeah, I'm calling in from the lands of the Kakite people, which is colonial known as New Westminster, and also home of other Hunkaminam speaking people traditionally. Yeah, that's what I got. That's where I live now. I used to be on the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam lands, but I'm now out in the burbs.
So thanks, Pedro.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with a few questions for the panel, but please feel free to sort of add questions as we go along for the panelists. There will be a moment, after some questions where we really turn to the Q&A, and I'll take a look at what's in the Q&A box and choose a few questions for us to respond to. But we're going to get the conversation started with the concepts of care. So again, I sort of thought about care and then creation. In regards to care, and I know that as artists and individuals, as people, I'm curious from each of the panelists, how do you care for yourself during times of acute distress, about the challenges that are being faced by the environment? And I mean, let's be honest, communities near and far, there's a lot to, I hate to be a bit of a bummer, but I think we all know there's a lot to be distressed by. But in terms of the climate crisis and the crises that are facing us, how do you care for yourself? Whoever wants to start.
I suppose I can start.
Thanks, Jodi.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's an important question and is going to become more and more important as we get further into the climate crises. For myself, it really depends on the season I'm in and what is working for me at that moment. Like, I find what is helpful for me shifts over time. And initially, when you asked the question, I was thinking about last summer, when we had over 100 wildfires burning in Alberta. I found myself really struggling with how to hold space for people around climate grief and climate anxiety because of the extent of my own. And at that time, it was really helpful for me to take a retreat and actually just go be in the forest for a few days by myself. And I actually took some books that pushed me further into my emotions. And I don't always recommend that for people, but for me, it can often be helpful to kind of find ways to sit with my emotions and give myself time to express them and to cultivate relationship with the land around me. So that's kind of one of the ways lately that I've been really taking care of myself in the midst of the climate crises. And then I think just the other thing I'll say briefly is finding community and finding and creating community spaces to process and to be in solidarity around these crises has been really, really important for me.
David, Pedro?
Yeah, it's true. It's really hard to, it feels like depending on what summer is like every year here in BC and across the country, it's hard to find moments of that care. But a couple ways for me is, one way is that I found I just had to channel it into what I was doing. Like, I had to not ignore it. And so part of that was why the piece was born, and how can I bring my whole self as both a person who is an activist and worried about the climate crisis, but also an artist, and what is my skills there in life. And then the other part is looking for good climate news, is as hard as that can be to find, is actively searching for breakthroughs in environmental things or environmental justice cases that are wins, and just reading about them and being like, yes, there was a win. There's a win today. Because at the time that I was writing Peace Country, the Peace Country was on fire. And while we produced it, it was the largest fire in BC's history. It was happening just north of the town I was talking about. So we had a good news climate change board, or climate good news board in rehearsal hall, where we talked about it.
Yeah. David, I know you popped a couple things in the chat.
Yes, I'm a big chat person, so
It's great.
People can read. I'm sorry if some people find it distracting when there's chat at the same time, but I actually love Zoom and I love chat. So I put a thing it's called a pepaha, and I use it all the time in my teaching and also when I go into workshops. And when you ask me how do I take care of myself, I like to be with other people, and I like to create new connections. And the way that Maori people introduce themselves, I would say, called Taranaki Tuku Manga. I'd introduce myself by my mountain, and then my river, and then my waka is a canoe, so my ancestral canoe, but waka also means like it can be your skateboard, it's a vehicle. And then your ancestors, and then your tribes, and then you say your name last because you're the least important person compared to all those things. You're a guardian for all those other things, and then you have to sing a song, a waiata. So I like to do those things to say this is who I am and this is where I'm from, and I also encourage people to introduce themselves as that, and with using that as a tool. So I just like to be with people. I don't like the idea of being alone when we're traumatized by things, and I liked to give people the opportunity to share where they're at. But I also wanted to pick up on Pedro's thing about the positive things. I really believe what Kim Sinclair Harvey said about we have to tell stories of Indigenous joy and success.
Yeah.
In fact, two of those for every one of trauma, and to redress the balance. And that's what I try and do too. I know that it's easy to go into doom scrolling and the things that are going wrong, and there's plenty to do, but I feel like an artist's job is partly to give hope. And we are actually in a privileged position to be artists who create things that people want to come and see, and that's my bottom line. So I want to make work that gives people hope, and that gives me hope, and that even if it's saying this is a really tough truth, like we have to move because these forest fires are going to devastate us, or this flood means we cannot live here any longer. Like New Zealand had a terrible Hurricane Gabrielle. Lots of people have had to move and will not be going back to those places. So that's terribly traumatic. But there's a lot of stories about how people are helping people move and find new places and work out what's going on. And so I want to promote those. Going back to forest fires, though, how many people have seen The Cave? The Thompson Highway, John Moland show. Like, I thought that was an amazing piece of work where it was acknowledging this terrible thing, but through the animals and the songs. And I went to that show and I was really moved by that. I thought it was a beautiful show. So
Yeah.
that's enough from me for now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and we're moving towards something that I'm also curious about. And there's like, we started through the lens of like, how do we care for ourselves? But we also talked about being in community and the unique power of bringing people together around something, around a story, around help, like community care and community support. And so I'm curious about, and in the spirit of bringing forth positive examples, are there examples of recent examples of community care, and they may be through the arts, or they may be, you know, I think all examples are good examples. Any recent examples of community care that you witnessed that really bolstered or inspired you? I mean, and while everyone's thinking, I'm happy to start with one. So we recently here, there was a desire in our community here around in the North Okanagan, and in particular, just outside Armstrong, British Columbia, which is where in the nearest town that is close to the caravan farm, to get involved in a Fire Smart BC neighborhood recognition, you know, convening. And a few of our neighbors approached us to ask us if we would lead that initiative, because we have the convening power, because we know how to get people together, and because we can gather people, and because we are because of our ways of communicating. And so we've been doing that, and it's been interesting. Sort of every 2 months we bring as many neighbors together as we can, and there's a growing number of neighbors, and communicate and put together contact lists and resource lists, and it's been fascinating to me to just watch how people need to speak. And you know, we're putting chairs in a circle, which is something that I take for granted as a thing you do when you want people to sort of speak to each other. But at so many meetings, you're in a row facing forward, and just the ability to put people in a circle and watching them talk about their fears. These are, farmers and ranchers and people who don't necessarily talk about their fears very often, but for whatever reason, this space that we're creating, I get a lot of feedback after we have those meetings about how much better people feel. And I keep trying to remember, how powerful it is just to place people in a space in a particular way that allows them to feel safe. And that's something that I've witnessed recently that has become profoundly meaningful, and is not about the shows that we're doing, but it's about the opportunity we have as people who bring people together to release things. And so many of these people have never been to the Caravan Farm Theater before, and they live down the road, but they're coming for this. And that's felt really potent to me, and I wanted to just bring that forward. Other examples?
I'm just going to speak on circles. Yolanda Bonnell said some amazing things in an interview about the importance of circles. And when I first was asked to do this, I was like, well, the way I take care is I have a circle outside of the work. I don't like going and sitting down and just reading scripts, where we all connect and check in and do what similar to that Pepper How idea, and then sing a song and then go into the work. And partly it was to kind of leave the world behind so we could go into the work. But I saw Yolanda talk and said, no, that the way that she viewed, or they viewed circles, was that it was a way to share things that we could then carry through the day, because things are going on for everybody. It's not about putting everything away. It's actually going, wow, that's going on for you. I want to help you carry that through our work in the room. And then at the end of the day, come back and have another circle to say, how did we go? And obviously in the work, you're sometimes dealing with traumatic things and that have come up. And so to then have this circle to end and and again, pick things up and also carry things for people. And so, yeah, that really changed my idea about the circle. But I think what you were talking about, Vicki, is also that they're really powerful, but they're also, some people have never experienced that.
Yeah.
And that for us, we go, oh yeah, we do that. Like, oh, I did that at drama school. I've been doing circles forever. But but I think that's one thing we can share, the power of the circle. And also I'm always very like, hey, I know that the circle isn't for everybody. And I've learned a lot coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand to Turtle Island, and I know the circle is different. How would you like the circle to go? Like the idea of like you talk for as long as you want to talk,
Right.
and you don't interrupt, and those kind of things are really interesting to me because not everyone has the same protocols. Anyway, yes, love circles. Thanks for bringing that up.
Jodi, Pedro, community care or reflection on circles. Jodi, go for it.
Yeah, I can kind of connect to the reflection on circles as someone who's pretty far outside of kind of the theater scene. Some of, I think, the content of today, I'm kind of like looking at how do I integrate this, or how do I reference it in my own kind of ways. And so I do a lot of community facilitation, specifically around eco grief and climate grief. And circle is something that's really powerful and really big in the work that we do. And so one of the frameworks that I use is called The Work That Reconnects. And it comes from Joanna Macy, who is an elder she's a white elder in her 90s now, who created this eco-philosophy kind of personal systems frame that's personal and also like looks at anti-oppression. And within that frame, there's a number of activities that move through gratitude, through a spiral or through a circle, moving from gratitude to honoring our pain for the world, into seen from different perspectives, and then into going forth. And so once a month, like I have a group that meets. Anyone who's welcome in Calgary can come, and it's like a community group that works around this circle. And it's been really powerful to see this circle kind of came out of the facilitations that I was doing, where people kept asking, how can we meet together more consistently to have conversations around climate grief and to find solidarity around in the midst of this, particularly in Alberta, where these conversations are often really polarized because of the political climate here and because of the extraction that happens here. And so it's been a really interesting and beautiful thing to watch people start to build relationship together around being able to share how they're feeling and what their experiences are around climate grief and climate anxiety in a place where it often feels like we can't. So that's kind of the one way. We also have like rituals that we do. And so a recent ritual we did was called the Truth Circle. And it is a ritual with quite a lot of protocol, where people come into the circle and are asked not to share until they step into the circle, and also are welcome to just witness the circle as well. Inside the circle, there are different items. So there's a stick for anger, there's a stone for fear, a bowl of water for grief, and an empty bowl for emptiness, and a pillow for any other emotion that's present there. And people are invited to step into the circle whenever they feel compelled and to share anything that they're struggling with or anything that comes up from that for them. And this can be systemic. It can be something around climate grief or around what's happening around the world, around genocide, or it could also be something connected to them personally, or the intersections in between and how one thing leads into the other. And it's been a really powerful way to be seen and be witnessed, and also to kind of share and carry some of those things together. Because I think when we do carry them together, it lightens the load as well. So I just talked for a long time, so I will finish now, but thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jodi. Pedro, do you have a...
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think things that have been kind of the witnessing are these smaller kind of cabaret style activities around the climate crisis, or how folks who are not necessarily artists. I mean, like I think of New World, and they've recently done one with Revolver that was Earth Case Scenario, and I think they've done a few of them, and it's kind of a celebration while tackling, you know, issues of climate crisis. How are these other artists, and they have Buy Nothing boutiques and stuff like that. And another one is to shout out to my home community is the two Indigenous bands that are just outside of Chetwynd, the Soto First Nations of West Moberly. They've kind of started circumventing kind of more formal, you know, the reliance on carbon economy, and they've recently started like a wind farm business. And so they will be installing wind farms all throughout the area, and kind of find a way to sustain a partnership between themselves and create their own kind of way out of reliance on this. And so like I think of that, of like, how are those remote rural areas going to survive if we're taking away their main thing? And that was one of those things of community care. They thought about, how can we build a future sustainably, even though we have relied, and they know it, like we've taught when I was researching Peace Country, their reliance and their like when they took money for the pipeline that went through and stuff, but like how did they turn that around and then use it for the future?
Yeah, that's great. It's it is interesting, you know, and Jodi sort of spoke to this, and then, you know, some of the examples are not necessarily theater or art examples. I do feel like, you know, I don't know, maybe I'll just speak for myself. I do feel like sometimes we can get a bit wrapped up in thinking about theater and art and mainly just talk about that. Even with, you know, an opportunity to sort of view the larger world. And I think sometimes, at least in my experience, I feel like I've spent a fair amount of time in the last probably 5 or 6 years trying to help articulate for myself the role of art or artists in community care, or in what we might be able to impact, how we might be able to impact the climate crisis, impact the way that people move through or imagine the future. There's all sorts of roles that we might have, and ways that we might support community. We've talked about a few of them: convening, storytelling, but I don't want to put Jodi on the spot, but Jodi, I might put you on the spot. Given that, as you said, you're not as steeped in the world of theater as say the rest of the panelists and myself, and probably many of the people watching today, I would just, would you reflect or what you think the role of artists and storytellers might be in responding?
Sure. Yeah. So, well, I think there's a large role, and like I'm sure you're all very aware of this quote, but there's a Toni Cade Bambara quote. She's a filmmaker, author, and activist who says the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I do really aspire to that and believe that even in like spaces where I wouldn't kind of call myself at all connected to theater or even an artist in a specific way. Most of the art I do is for myself personally, but convening and creating community spaces, I think, can also be a form of making revolution irresistible. And I think art and artists have a large role to play there around telling different stories and around opening up new perspectives and just like cultivating imagination. And I think when we live in a place where there is a lot of despair and a lot of cynicism because of the things that we see happening around us, it can become really easy to not opt into imagination. Or I am saying that in a weird way, but it can be hard to opt into imagination or to connect to our imagination. And so, and I like a small example of this is I did a seventh generation activity at the last climate grief retreat that I led that actually invited people. This also comes from the work that reconnects to connect with ancestors 7 generations in the future, and then to have those ancestors. So one person was playing the ancestor speak back to the current generation about how we shifted our narratives around the climate crises and how we changed. And it was really, really difficult for people to move into that space of imagination. And so I really think that is the role of art, and the role of artists is to invite people into that space and to enlarge our imaginations.
Thanks, Jodi. Pedro, David, is there do you have a reflection that you want to share about how you might describe the role or the potential of artists and storytellers in responding to Pedro? Go for it, man.
Yeah, I mean, this came from when I was working on The Only Animals Slime. We did a lot of climate research and you talked a lot about, read a bunch of books and reading studies that like this isn't new, right? The information we have isn't new, and it's been shouted at us by scientists so much that we've now become desensitized to it. So it's now the scientists need us, the artists, to take all of the good research that's out there, all of these things, whether it's bad or it's very stark, and to interpret it the way we can in order to make the public take action. And that's kind of what's behind my philosophy of working, is that like my role of artists in working right now is we can either make people comfortable and enjoy an evening, or we can make them uncomfortable in a way that will make them take action, or to start a discussion, or to rethink the way they're framing their role in the climate crisis, because we all have a role in it, whether it's the singular person or those larger corporations. And so that's kind of where I see the artists, is that there's plethora of great readings and videos and documentaries, all these things for us to then take and put in a way that isn't allowing the public to be desensitized by it anymore.
David, I'd love to hear from you too. I also am thinking about climate change theater action, which I know you've been involved in, and how that's evolved over the years too. But let us know what.
Yeah, I have a whole lot of thoughts.
Great.
I think there's a very good reason, like it's horrible to think of, but totalitarian regimes go for artists first. They know how powerful imagination is. There's plenty of filmmakers, artists, journalists locked up and killed because they know how powerful that they are around the world. And yeah, the biggest challenge I find is what Oscar Wilde said. He said art is useless. And there is there is also a narrative that people want to make art seem useless. Oscar Wilde was kind of joking because he was saying that beauty is something that's worth celebrating, but at a certain point, art isn't the thing. And I just celebrate all the little revolutions, and I just put one in there that if you haven't seen the documentary Singing Back the Buffalo by Tasha Hubbard, it's an amazing documentary about the genocide of buffalo and bison in North America and how they're coming back, and the teachings around them are coming back, and the songs that weren't, there was no buffalo or bison to sing with or have come back, and how important they are to the ecosystem. Like, I never knew about wallows. Does anyone know about a wallow? Where they all get on their backs and try and rub off all the horse flies, and they make a dent in the ground and they cover themselves in dust, and then it rains and they create water holes. That's actually the buffalo who create, and bison that create the water holes for everyone else to come and do their thing, the insects and the birds. And also they carry around in their beards seeds, so they are distributing all the seeds around. So I just was like, this is a revolutionary film. I want everyone to see this, to understand how important they were and are, and also the knowledge that goes with coming back. And so that's a piece of art, that's a documentary that I think really changes what changed me, and I become a person who always says, you must see this. I know there's a lot of things we must see. We get told we must see that. You must see that. But I think that's where, like, a documentary like that is irresistible. That you watch it and go, that's why we do what we do. And I know that we struggle sometimes as artists to justify what we do. And there's a lot of people against, who go, yeah, art, no one needs art. Like, come on, we need business. We need, but as someone just articulated, people don't get inspired by spreadsheets too much, but they do get, well, they can be, but they want that transformative, transcendent experience which only art can give you, which is in song and opera and dance and music. And so yeah, I know it's a struggle, but I feel that power of that, and that art can be a revolution. But that's why we're here today, right? Because we're all going, how do we take something which is very tough and traumatic, and I think we all have that sense of like, well, I don't want to just present that, because that kind of bums people out. Right, that's the truth. But the other thing we want to do is create something from that gives people, again, I'm going to go back to it, to gives them hope. But in some ways, sometimes just saying the truth, truth telling is the first step. Like, this is, but at the moment we've got this misinformation war. It's like, yeah, that's not the truth. This is the truth. This is the truth. This is the truth. So we also have to allow for a lot of complexity. And that's where I'm at with that question. Thank you.
It is true, the complexity. It's, and I think too, when we think about, there's the truth telling about what is happening now, and then that concept of imagination, and the difficulty we have about, we can sometimes have about imagining a future, much less a future that we would like to live in. Because I think our negativity bias as people sometimes allows us to think about dystopias, lots of dystopias we can contemplate. And utopia feels a bit easily dismissed because we know that there's more complexity than perfection. And I'm curious too, a lot of what we see when we're introduced to what the future might look like is so technological, and not that technology isn't a great thing, but sometimes it's like, well, how are they, like, so we're taking these electric hover trains to work, but we still have to work, really? So how do our lives change, and how do we allow people to sort of see themselves in the future is something that I'm very curious about, and And I'm also curious about the evolving way that we're telling stories or thinking about the stories we tell. And I'd love to hear, has this, or how has, I guess, is the question, because I'm going to make an assumption that it has. How has the, your own evolving understanding about and experience of the climate crisis, has it changed what stories you tell, or the type of stories you tell, or the way you tell stories, the way you work? So I'm curious from both Pedro and David, and Jodi too, if you have a reflection on this. How have things changed for you in terms of your work as an artist, as you've had to personal evolution and as you see the conversation around the climate crisis change?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think so, like, sometimes I think theater is the slowest form of art there is. It takes us years to workshop and then get it to a stage, and then it's in a dark theater, and then only so many people see it, and then what is the change that happens? So I struggle with that, but that's also what I know. And so my art has changed to reflect that. And as I write stories, I what is another facet of, like, how can I write pieces that don't always have to be about it, but include it, right? Just like how all of my plays are Latinx plays, because I'm Latinx, they don't have to be a Latinx play, right? And so that's one way things have changed. Is so is like, how is stories and narratives and the characters in my plays reflective of what's happening now or in the time. And then another thing is about what is the practices that my company is doing outside of that go beyond simply the show that happened. And so a lot of things we've done at Rice and Beans is, like, we repurpose sets, like, for 2 or 3 productions, and like cut things down and reuse and get repaint, and trying to purchase as little things as possible from previously. And that was one way that it's like, oh, and that's not nothing we're doing, and like, or it's, that's not the whole point, but it's like we have these resources. And then the other one is right now is my practice. I sit here and I'm sitting here with youngins, and about the future of that and the immediacy of what needs to be out there, and how can I start making pieces that are not just in a theater, but out out there in front of people, where the people are, especially in the Lower Mainland, where on a if you do a show in the summer that's not in a park, it's going to be hard to get people in a dark box to leave the beach or whatever, right? So so that's where I think another phase of my personal practice and creation will be, is to find ways to make directed, smaller, personal pieces out in reality.
That's Pedro.
I just put a thing, because we were talking about greening things. There's a big, because I work in the film industry and I teach at Capilano University in the Indigenous Film Program. There's a lot of talk about how to make the film industry greener, and also obviously theatre. But in terms of my own practice, I think I never studied history at school or at university, but I feel like a lot of my work now is actually making history present and giving people context to what's happening now. Like, one of the reasons why we feel this grief and trauma is because we don't understand why certain things are happening right now. And I feel like what we need more of is actually for people to tell stories that give us context to understand what's going on. And there's certain conflicts around the world that are happening right now where people go, oh my God, that just started? How did that ever happen? And people don't really go, and it takes a while to go, actually, it happened because of this, which happened 100 years ago, which you need to go back 500 years, or you need to understand this. So a lot of my work is trying to create context around that. And in New Zealand, you probably don't know, but maybe you do, that there is a new government who's got in, who is quite right wing, and they are quite, actually, I would say, anti-Maori, and they are trying to roll back things and not tell the history, like, just very much the, oh, come on, everyone's okay now, let's just get on, right? We've got a crisis, we're having an energy crisis, we're going to stop, we're going to mine the parks, we're going to go back to undersea and oil exploration because we're in a crisis. So a lot of my work now is going, why are they telling that narrative, and how do we combat that narrative, and how do we understand why people are what they are? And a lot of it comes down, people are afraid of change, and we've seen a lot of that. And dare I say it, that's what MAG is about too, like creating this idea of we could go back to this place and be this thing. And there's a lot of empire building going on at the moment by certain big players, and things are changing very fast. So a lot of my work is like trying to, for me to understand why these things have happened now, but also help other people find the things that will help them understand. And I'm going to put in a book by Jeff Rubin that just came out about the way the world has changed, and the sanctions haven't worked. And in fact, some parts in Europe have gone back to coal-powered coal power stations, right? So you have to understand why that has happened. But again, you need to have a big net and a lot of reading, and also read what you don't want to read, and find out why those people believe what they believe. So that's a long-winded thing of that's what I'm concentrating on my work. How do I give people some context, and how do I myself find context for what's happening, so that I can then go, can I change this a little bit? Can I move the dial a little bit? I just learned and a lot of it is like polarization and trying to resolve conflicts. This idea of looping, I don't know if you've ever heard of looping in terms of journalists, where
Tell us more.
you don't react, because often someone will say something, or we'll see something, we'll just have a reaction to it, right? Because they'll say something outrageous. They want to polarize you. So journalists have a thing where they say, where you try and summarize what someone says. Oh, so let me summarize what you're saying. You believe this, and okay, I get it. Is that right? So you're actually not going straight into a confrontational position. You're actually trying to understand why someone believes something that you find offensive or completely wrong-headed. Like, you've got to suspend your judgment and then try and find some common ground by going, okay, I just want to understand what you're trying to say. Is this what you want to say? And that, okay, great. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? You'll see really good journalists are good at that, and then they'll turn it around, hopefully. Anyway, that's very long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, gosh, not at all. I do want to sort of let people know, I'm going to just ask one more question, just sort of pick up on some of the things we've just been talking about, and then we will sort of start to look at the Q&A and have a bit of some questions from the audience, so the participants. So feel free to start populating the Q&A. I'll take a little look back at it in a moment, but it's interesting, talking about looping and talking about conversations, and even, Pedro talking about the evolution of the kind of work that you're looking to do, this sort of like being out in the world. I don't want to make any assumptions, but I mean, as I sort of said earlier, sometimes professional theater artists, we tend to just mainly talk to other professional theater artists, and within urban environments. And again, I don't want to make any assumptions about Vancouver, but I think that there's sometimes an assumption that our audience is probably around the same as we are in terms of our perhaps our socio-political leanings, or thoughts, and it is interesting from a community perspective to, and increasingly for me, perhaps this is something that I'm fascinated by, because I now live in rural interior British Columbia, and indeed, I talked about that Fire Smart program that we had. You had a conversation with a neighbor who's scared about wildfire, who also doesn't acknowledge human-caused climate change, even though we're talking about the wildfires. So it's one of those. It's like, okay, how the constant sort of navigation of the real world and that polarization, or even that sense of how we engage with people who how much we may have to loop a bit, I guess, is as we encounter more people. And I guess I wanted to just acknowledge that, and perhaps, Jodi talked about being in Alberta and talking about climate change, which of course I grew up in Alberta, worked worked at a environmental organization in Alberta, and certainly, experienced that, and Pedro working, knowing Chetwynd and knowing that the northern community and the relationship to extraction, and for that matter, any of us who are able to be out in the world and not necessarily always speaking to the people that we're used to. I guess I'm curious about the question that I'm driving at, which may not be perfectly formed, but looping is one of the things that David talked about. What other things have you discovered about how to make connections across across experience or belief or perspective? So I'd love to hear from Jodi, Pedro, and David about this, and then we'll move into the Q&A. Jodi, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about this as David was talking, because looping to me sounds a lot like active listening. Like, as like a eco-spiritual coach or director, a lot of the work that I end up doing is around asking people questions that open up their life experience, where they can start to then look at their life experience in a different way and start to like make some of those connections about belief systems they might or might not have had. So like an example of this that's not actually from spiritual direction, but from like an event we did in Lethbridge a few years ago, where we were working with elders, is we were kind of sharing a bit of my story, and my coworker at the time was sharing a bit of her story. And at the end, I had a gentleman come up to me who was in his probably 70s, 80s, who talked to me about being the last person in an active clear cut, like that he knew he was going to clear cut an old growth forest the next day. He had been a logger his entire life. And I think in Alberta, we often come at these conversations a very specific way that is very political. But when we're able to come at these conversations from a human to human kind of perspective, and around grief, and around like, what are the anxieties you have about your future, about your children's future, about the economics that we're living in and the economic drivers of this province, we can actually start to get a little bit deeper or underneath some of those like polarizing questions and polarizing kind of reactions. I say this, and it's not perfect. It doesn't always work. Like, I come from a MAGA family who I cannot have conversations with about any of this kind of any of this content. But I do find when you're meeting people that maybe there's not those deeply historic relational connections with, you can really open up some of these conversations by just asking questions, and then getting them to reflect on their own experiences, and then making those connections back to the systems by asking questions around that too. And giving people places to engage their grief and engage their anxiety and engage the fears about change. I think 3/4 of the work I do is around how do we navigate change. And a lot of the anxiety people have around the world that they're in really has to do with that, with transition, with not being in control, but not being willing to admit that. And when they're given spaces where it can feel safe enough to admit that, I think we can flip some of those scripts a little bit, or at least open them up a bit.
Nice, Jodi. Pedro?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, growing up in the north is like living in Alberta, basically. We're more politically aligned to Alberta politics than I'd say anything, and I see a real divide between the urban and rural, and that's what the whole play was about, really. And thank you, David, for looping. I love it. It's what I had to do in the whole interviewing process of Peace Country, and I find like that's what it is right now we're seeing these rise of these right-wing parties and all these things, and they're so able to divorce themselves of small things that they don't believe in someone because of the larger goal. Whereas I feel myself, like, I like to say I'm more left-leaning and leftist and activist, but the shades of things we cannot agree on for the greater cause. And so in that I find it because sometimes people just don't want to talk about it. They're like, oh, you're disagreeing with me, so I don't even want to broach the subject. And so a lot of it was just actually having to re-examine my own values and know how unshakable they are. And invest in them, and like, what are the things that are my values that I'm holding within this climate crisis? What are the things I'm trying to change? And having those conversations with people that I know are going to say that what I'm doing is absurd, the practices I do that are this or that, and then sitting through that and being able, and not everyone can do that. Like I did it because it came from a place of love, and mine was with family members and with friends that I've had since I was in the womb. And so the only way I was able to do it was with love and with patience. And so then taking that and putting that into the art. And so yeah, that looping is a great way to remember what I'm doing when I'm going to have to do it with strangers as it continues to go on. And but there is that thing. Yeah, sometimes I think, Jodi, thank you. It's people want to express their fears that they're having, and if we run away from their fears, thinking they're just bad people, or that they're their job and not humans, or that we're all living under a capitalistic and colonial society that needs to serve, that has put dollars above everything, and not examining what are what is the situation that has them in this? Why are they out there on oil rigs? Why are they laying pipeline as the workers, and why are we yelling at them instead of demanding better from the people who are actually controlling that?
David, is there anything you want to add before we move to a question from the Q&A?
No, I just put in a link to Jeff Rubin's book.
Awesome, thank you. What you were just saying, Pedro, about and Jodi and Pedro were both, I think, sort of reflecting on the intersecting. We talk about the climate crisis, and sometimes it's something very specific comes to mind, but of course there's a lot of intersecting issues, and somebody in the chat has asked that question. And even, it makes me think too about, I know that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are, like any system, far from perfect, but the fact that it's not this, that sustainability, but even when we say the word sustainability, I think we think about recycling and stuff, but there's human sustainability, there's community sustainability, there's food, there's equality, there's safe places to live. So the question was, can you comment on how the climate crisis and your work around the climate crisis, in terms of its intersectionality with other issues? So what other aspects of your identity or values or other challenges inform your approach to your work around climate change, or how you address it in your work? Thanks for that question, anonymous attendee.
I can jump in here, and this might not be the most articulate, but for me, all systems of oppression are interconnected. And so if we're going to talk about the climate crises, to me, the assumption is it is always interconnected with colonialism, with patriarchy, with capitalism. And so we also have to be deconstructing those in our community spaces, in our conversations. I have to be deconstructing that in my own life. And so for me, I think my work is deeply informed by my own processes around that. So I came from like a Christian family that was like very fundamentalist. And I'd say the last 15 years of my life have been really intersected with coming out as queer, letting go of / dismantling what patriarchy has looked like in my life, what colonization has looked like in my life, and the ways that I've perpetuated it, and the ways that I continue to perpetuate it. And to me, that's a lifelong process. And that's a lifelong process that is intersected as well with the community spaces I'm in. So when we're talking about climate grief, it is always within those lenses, and it is always connecting it back to missing and murdered women and Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks in Alberta and across the world, and recognizing how extraction and how the oil industry has perpetuated that in order to move people off land, in order to break up family systems. So I think it is interesting to be doing this work in Alberta, where those conversations sometimes can feel very tricky to have. And that's why, for me, I think coming from curiosity and coming from places where you can open up those questions and help people to start to explore them and their deep-seated histories with them for themselves, that can actually be a way that people can start to dismantle and start to own and be aware of and responsible for their own histories too. And so to me, they all intersect. If we don't heal it, we perpetuate it. And that's kind of like what I live by and what I hope to like invite people into as well in my work.
Yeah. Thanks, Jodi. Pedro, David?
I guess I'd just, it's all part of a bigger colonial empire that goes on and on. It's a big machine that's done a really great job and it continues to do it. But keeping us in a state of fear is one part of it, that we could lose a lot of things if we don't shore up our energy, right? This is what we're at now. But what interests me is just how the other things, like in terms of grief, it's just that, oh, didn't we just fight for that in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now we're fighting for it again? Like, that's what interests. The worst part for me is the homophobia, the transphobia, and this fear of diversity, that we've seen this kind of growth of like, hey, you can actually have these other identities with gender and sexuality, and some people just find that so confronting, and they're fighting back in a big way. We probably shouldn't be surprised, but that's what I find really like, wow, we're fighting this drag queens in libraries. That's what it's coming down to. Like, you've found that, like, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's a very hardcore Maori Christian guy who's gone around encouraging people to paint over rainbow crosswalks. So that's the battleground, right? It's just like, wow, are we there? Is that where we're at? So again, I think it comes from fear of change, and then someone's gone, where we're going to change that. We're going to go back to men and women and none of these weird bathrooms. And like, I thought we'd fought that and won it and it was over, but it's not. So that's one thing that's going on. But also this, I feel like the military industrial complex is winning again in a very big way. And the bigger message is, humans will always have war and we'll always have to fight each other, and we must be afraid of each other. And that is a narrative, unfortunately, that I think is very pervasive at the moment. And that's what I go, wow, we're going to spend this much money on weapons again to do, like, I think it's partly because I went to university in the 1980s, and I spent a whole lot of time worried about nuclear war then. And then things changed. But again, going back to this idea of history, you start to go, oh, well, it comes in waves and we have to fight again. And there has to be a new shoring together of how do we fight against these, as we've seen around the world, different government, right-wing, let's call them right-wing, groups being able to see how they can win elections and bundling together a whole bunch of different people who wouldn't normally hang out together, but they are very powerful. And so I guess, again, it's back to, okay, we need to work out who all those people are and how they're working, and what do we do against that? Why aren't we strong enough to fight against that? And how do we create communities and then maybe take out this word fight and go, how do we understand that and build things? Like, I actually don't like saying left wing and right wing. I think that is directly what we get into problems with, polarization. We just have to go, yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant, but there we go. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, David. Pedro, is there anything you want to reflect on before we move to another question?
No, they've so beautifully said by both of them, and everything would just, I say, would be a pile on and more. So I think we can move on. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. These questions are great. I'm gonna move around in the questions. I'm not necessarily gonna do chronological order, but there's one that's popped up that I think is sort of continues the discussion, and so this attendee noted that there's been a lot of discussion about resistance to change, and the fear of change, and wanted to know, can you talk about making change more accessible to people in the context of climate action? But hey, if there's another context as well, how might we make change more accessible to people?
I mean,
Pedro?
if I frame it in the way, because we're here at the GVPTA theater, right? The way we approached it in Peace Country when I was writing and when I was talking with Heidi Taylor, my dramaturg, about this, is the lingo, right? The way we talk about change, and that change, often when we talk about change and we know it's for the future and what we need, often in the way we talk about it, it seems like we're leaving people out, and that fear of being left out or left behind can cause people then to have that reaction to pull back. And so in order for this to, how can we present change that includes everyone, and what is everyone's role in that future? So like when we look at, say, the just transition, or moving away from a carbon economy, like where do all those people who have jobs that will lose their homes, that have children that rely on them for groceries through these carbon jobs, what is the path for them that is being built to that change? Not just simply the change and what that future is. How are we including them all, and the people who already have moved away from that, right? And so like that's kind of how I think about it, is like the change, the resistance is because it seems like you're not worthy of coming along for the change, and we haven't given you a path towards that change because we're already here, and you're not a good person because you're not here with us already. That's kind of where I see that resistance coming from.
Yeah, people being able to see themselves in a future. Yeah. Jodi?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the piece that I would add on to it is, so there's a diversity educator named Shaquille Chaudhry who wrote a book called Deep Diversity, and he talks about emotions being the work of social change. And so I always use that to talk about emotions being the work of environmental change too, because I think we also have a crisis on Turtle Island around mental health and around talking about mental health. There's so much stigma around it. And I think when people feel fear of change, they move into places having radical ideologies. A lot of times, I know that's a really strong statement, but I think there can be a shift towards that. And so I think we need to have spaces where we are able to come back together to talk about our emotions, to talk about our anxieties, to talk about our fears, to destigmatize the conversations around mental health as well. Because often it isn't the facts that keep us from moving towards climate solutions or sustainability. We have a lot of the facts that we need. We don't have the emotional wherewithal or the ability to change people's deep-seated emotions around these ideologies. And we need to create spaces where we can do that. And coming back to art, I think that is something that art has the power to do, is to invite people to think about things in different ways.
David?
I think one of the things is that it's like a holier than thou, because it's like, oh, I'm going to judge you. I think that's a very tricky position to put yourself in. And I think we all have to acknowledge how entangled we are in it. Like, I'm sitting here in New Zealand. I took 2 aeroplanes to get here, right? That's carbon, right? And we're driving cars and we're benefiting from that. We're very deeply entangled in it, and yet we want to criticize it. And I can see why people see that as hypocrisy, right? But I just want to say that those little changes can really make a difference. Like, I try and take transit all the time. I'm always on transit. I know that sounds like the smallest thing, but also becoming a vegetarian changes things, because we also have this thing about, well, if we all, it's just so embedded in meat eating, right? But there's simple little things and make it easier to cycle around your cities. Those kind of things are the little steps. But yeah, sorry, those were like little thoughts. I see there is quite a few questions in the chat there, Vicki.
Yeah, I was gonna move into another one here in the Q&A box. And it is actually, it's the one particularly directed to David and Pedro about power versus uselessness of art. And there's a request for you to describe what a good outcome, and by good, it's like what you're looking for, not some sort of amorphous good, the good. What would be good for you? What do you hope for an outcome of your work vis-a-vis the climate crisis?
Well, I'll just do another shout out for Climate Change Theatre Action that
Yeah.
I put a link in. That was an amazing movement. Chantal Bilodeau, Elena Vila, and other people that they commissioned 50 plays. They've done it 5 times, and people around the world do them. And so when I hear that someone in Italy has translated my little tiny play into something, and we're having a conversation about how to do it, I feel like we're finding that community. We don't feel so alone. And to me, that is a great outcome. That organization and what they've done, that initiative, is a really awesome one. So I just would encourage other people to go onto that site, read all the plays, do them in your community, gather people together, and then, as we've talked, but sit in a circle and say, how are we all feeling? What are we going to do? How can we support each other? That would be an outcome that I would like. Okay, over to you, Pedro.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me it is that I think in every piece I've ever written, I've never wrapped anything up nicely. There's never been a good ending. I like to fade to explosion, as I like to joke, but it's true. Because I don't think I have the answers, and I should not think I have them. I have questions that are hurting me. That uselessness, that's what my art is a response to that uselessness. And so I hope that uselessness that I feel, that I put onto a page or whatever I end up doing with it, like I said earlier, it makes action, and that action can be from someone going home and talking about it, or coming back to another, or finding more climate change, like reading the climate action theater change stuff, or as happened with Peace Countries, that people started asking me what the North was really like. And that was creating the change I wanted, was that we need to create dialogue to move forward together. And I was like, great, I can talk to you all about that. I can talk to you about Chetwynd and the Peace region. Outside of that, I'm not an expert, but and even not an expert that much anymore. And so that's kind of the good outcome. I don't know if I shoot for a good outcome. I just hope for outcomes. Because the truth is, I'm putting something out there and someone could react badly. And that is a reaction, but at least we'll see how that goes. I don't know. That might not answer your question there about around the still, and I still feel useless because with the work, they leave the theater, and I'm hoping that's what I write in those grants, that I want people to be talking and stuff like that. And I hope they are.
Yeah. Thanks, Pedro. I know we have time for, and I'm going to put another question from the Q&A up for you folks, but I have a final question too that I wanted to ask before we sort of move into closing. Are there practices that you personally, this is from the Q&A, the practices you'd personally like to see being wider spread in the theater sector in regards to acknowledging or tackling the climate crisis? What needs more momentum? What could take off? What would you like to see happen? And I think Jodi, not being immersed in the theater sector, how would you hope that, like, an artistic practice that it brings people together both to create and to receive storytelling? What would you hope for? But yeah, Pedro, David, do you want to start? What would you like to see more of?
Sure. I love talkbacks at shows. I don't like clapping, everyone goes home. And I know that that seems like, oh man, every show that actors are going to come out or someone's going to come out. But for me, like for Māori on Marae, we always have the reason we're there is to engage in conversation and to have dialogue. And if there's a performance, then we talk. So that would be the big change. I feel like we gather people and we present something, but we often don't ask them to present back or reflect back to us. We say, maybe please do a shout out for us on Twitter. Come to the show. Like we're doing a bit of a huckster. Yeah, come on. But actually, I love talkbacks, and that's what I would make every show a talkback show. Like, so that's my big change. That because I think people want to talk, they want to be, and they again, it's creating a circle with the performers and the people who make the show. Thanks.
May I build on that? Because I agree. I do think that we do have this golden opportunity that we often simply use for advertising purposes. To bring people together. And I would say too, what I would like to encourage is a deeper practice amongst amongst theater makers and people who are doing that hosting to deepen their facilitation practice, to allow for those to be really powerful and deep conversations. I feel like sometimes it feels like those things can just feel like you're supposed to just tell people whether, you just like people feel like they can tell you whether or not they like the show or not, which isn't necessarily the kind of conversation. So how we intentionally engage in those talkbacks, I think is something that I'd like to see as well. So yeah, just to add to that, thanks for that, David, because I totally agree. Pedro, what do you think? What do you want to see, man?
I mean, I want to see this now, some nice, really well curated and moderated talkbacks after every show, because I agree. I mean, there were some things that came up in our Peace Country talkbacks that I was grateful that they were able to be there. And I think also just like outside of the art, like for theater specifically, like what is in the whole, from you entering the theater door to the thing, how is that making it critical thinking and not simply just to arrive for an event to engage with, but is there an interactive element to the whole thing that lingers with them? Like with like this wasn't around the climate piece, but it was a piece we did at Rice and Beans during the pandemic, and Derek did such a lovely job with it. It was his piece Yellow Objects, and which tackled the umbrella revolution and what's going on with Hong Kong and its independence and the terrible stuff happening with the suppression of democracy there. But he created like a video game that did something, and afterwards there were things you could fill out, and it went beyond simply just the one transactionary experience. I think it's something that we want to check in with the people who are coming to us to be in community with us and continuing that relationship of community.
Jodi?
I think the only thing that I would maybe say is like when I do retreats or even spiritual direction, like there's a few questions I always want people to leave with, and they're around like, what questions did this provoke for you? And how are you integrating your learnings into your life and your community? And so as I'm listening to you all talk about talkbacks, that's one of the things that I'm kind of wondering if there are places for that continued conversation. What questions were provoked? What made you feel uncomfortable? And how do you integrate it?
Yeah, I mean, that invitation to integrate the show into your life. I mean, I guess I'm just gonna speak for myself. I have this hope that people do that. But I guess I never really invite them to. Maybe I should invite them to. That's something I'm going to take away. That's something I'm going to take away for sure. I know that we're going to sort of move into wrap up here soon, and we've been chatting for a while, and this has been really great discussion. And I want to thank everyone for the questions and the things that have been added to the chat. I would just love to hear from each of you, and I know David's left some recommendations of films and books and things like that, and Jodi and Pedro both have them as well. Is there a piece of is there a book, a poem, a song, a play, a piece of theater, piece of visual art, just something that keeps you looking forward, that inspires you to create or to care in the midst of what we're experiencing as a range of, as we said, crises, that including the climate crisis. What's a piece of art that is potent for you? And I'm happy to start. For me right now, it's my friends' gardens, which I don't know if they would refer to as art, but I have the great good fortune now to live near, I mean, the garden here at Caravan Farm Theater, my friend Lisa's backyard, my friend Jason's backyard, like all these carefully tended, beautifully curated places and spaces. I find them deeply moving and grounding, and sometimes wish I could just, although they're all very private people, take people on garden tours of my friends' gardens. So those are the artworks that I'm feeling. So I'll put that out there. David, you just dropped something in the chat.
I did. This show does not deal with the climate crisis directly, but it's definitely about healing. And I think that's for Indigenous communities, it's a really celebratory show. And Reservation Dogs was made by Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi. And we talk about this like because it's about trauma, how to deal with trauma. And this shows you how young people and their communities get together to heal each other and be with each other and be super funny and super real with each other. And it really is an amazing show. And it's got a few awards and it's got some thing, but not everyone. It's kind of reached its level now, and I fear that not enough people are going to see it. And to me, it's a beautiful, beautiful show, and I want everyone to see it. And I also would put a shout out to Snotty Nose Res Kids, who are a great hip hop band, and we talk about like, oh, the young, what's the future? They are the future. The people in that show and Snotty Nose Res Kids, they are doing some really great stuff, and I just want to put their names out there. And they're not like straight into climate change and climate crisis, but they're about Indigenous power and humor and healing. Thank you.
David. Yeah, we can totally add those to the chat. I wish Pedro or Jodi?
Sure.
Go
So
for it, Jodi.
sure. So there's a couple for me that are a little older, but one is Emergent Strategy, the book by Adrienne Maree Brown. Her principles for emergent strategy are things that I always come back to, and they're things like they're about like what we do at the small scale is what we do at the large scale, and looking at like how we're scaling things up and down. They're about like trusting, like, yes, about trust the people and they become trustworthy. They're like, I think they're just like really intuitive wisdom based on connection to earth that I've learned a lot from around community organizing. And then the second thing is Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World by Tyson Yunkaporta, who is an Aboriginal author from Australia. And I've read it multiple times because just the way he writes and the way he thinks about like change, I think is so beautiful. And I can't say much more than that, but you should go read it. And then the third is Funeral for a Future by Brooke McNamara. And that's a poem. And that seems maybe counterintuitive when it comes to looking forward, since it's entitled Funeral, but it really is about dreaming downward and like what happens after we lose everything and how do we dream in different and new ways. And it's been living with me for the last 6 months. Yeah. So those are the three I'd recommend.
Thanks, Jodi. Feel free to pop them in the chat too. Pedro.
Yeah, I mean, something that keeps me going, if not theater as well. I was thinking about this when you asked this question and I was like, having little ones, it's hard to find time to really read into deep things. But what has kept me going in creating is I come from the punk rock scene, which was, started in rebellions against systems and of a time and all those things. But what has really reinvigorated me, I kind of left it for a while, but what has got me back in are these new bands, such as like Bad Cop, which is like a feminist lesbian group from California, and they're and AJJ who write these are in like a folk punk thing, and they're like David was saying, those are speaking truths. They're putting into the lyrics, almost returning to the days of like Woody Guthrie and the labor movements and those artists, and it's beautiful to see that that youth again are doing it. And then I have this quote that I go to sometimes when I fear that I like to start, that I'm gonna do it wrong, that it's all those things, and it's from Maya Angelou, and it's you do the best that you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better. Um, and so that's kind of helps me to stop from having the fear of starting a project of fucking up. So from the start, and knowing that I probably will, and that I can once I know better to do better.
Awesome. Thanks, Pedro.
Mhm.
And thanks, everybody. I was about to pass it off to Michelle, so welcome back, Michelle.
Hello, thank you. Wow, just huge thank you to everyone for your time and putting such really interesting and just thoughtful things into the space. It's really such a rich conversation that we've had. Obviously, this chat is so full of resources and interesting thoughts. It's really been wonderful. So I'm so grateful for everyone putting their time in. Just to everyone who's attending, this will be all available to reflect. If you want to have a look, if you showed up a bit late, if you want to share this with friends, this will be on our website probably by the end of the week, as well as our two other panels, one that happened this morning and one that's going to happen in about half an hour. So our next and final panel of today is around dealing with challenging content, really focused on how we do that in the room. Omari Newton is facilitating that. It's going to be a really interesting chat. And again, if you're interested in attending our in-person day, it's next week, next Monday at the BMO Studios. Today is the last day to register, so please get online and register. If you're having any concerns about financial ability to come, we have subsidies, so please apply if you have any concerns at all around ticket prices. Thank you so much to our ASL interpreters, Alex and Monica, for being here with us today. And we really look forward to seeing everyone and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.